Okay, after I had the wrong thing pushed. We'll see if anybody joins us here for the live stream, and if not, it all works. Oh, we got someone watching on YouTube. That's nice. Well, we'll just get started here and see if anybody wants to join us, and we'll go from there. Bring this up real quick. All right. So, hi, everybody. My name is Brian Schott. I am an independent journalist, and I am the publisher and managing editor of Utah Political Watch. You can sign up for my newsletter at utahpoliticalwatch.news. I hope you do that. You can also join me on my socials, and we're just trying out this live thing because we're going to probably do it live during the election night as well. So I just want to make sure this thing works. But there's a few things we need to talk about tonight. A few news stories that happened, especially one today. Everybody keeps wondering what's going to happen in the election that's coming up on Tuesday, specifically in the gubernatorial race, because this is a situation we haven't seen for a number of years where you have not only a Republican and a Democratic candidate, but you have write-in who is challenging, actively campaigning, spending money on that campaign. So people are wondering just what kind of an impact that Phil Lyman, the Republican state legislator who lost in the GOP primary, what kind of an impact he might have on this race. If you will remember, he beat incumbent Republican Spencer Cox at the Republican convention in April. Boy, it was way back in April. They beat him in April. Got about 2,500 votes, 65% of the vote, to become the convention nominee. And but when we went to the primary, everyone expected Cox to have an easy victory, and it was a little bit closer than people expected. That was kind of surprising with just how close that one was. Cox won with 54% of the vote. There were people who were expecting him to go about 60%, but he won with 54% of the vote. And Lyman got 46%. And so after that, Lyman decided to launch a write-in, and his write-in campaign, it's about what you would expect if you know anything about Phil Lyman. His campaign has leaned hard into conspiracy theories. They have claimed that Spencer Cox did not qualify for the ballot through his signatures. That's not true. They've been misrepresenting the results of an audit that suggested some changes to the signature verification process. Lyman, when it was clear that he was going to lose the primary, started raising questions about the signature verification process, trying to challenge whether Spencer Cox would have made it onto the ballot that way, whether he submitted the 28,000 signatures. There's been all sorts of conspiracies about that. They've been misrepresenting this audit, saying that it showed that Cox didn't qualify for the ballot. That's wrong. He actually did qualify for the ballot. Anyway, so people have been wondering what sort of impact having someone like Phil Lyman on the ballot would be. And we now have an idea. There's some scenarios out there where maybe Lyman could take enough of the vote from Brian King, the Democrat. Excuse me, Lyman could take enough of the vote from Spencer Cox to open the door for Brian King, split the vote three ways. And as I said, we have an idea now. It was a poll released just today by Noble Predictive Insights, And I published a story about that. And you can see right here, this is the, sorry, let me move myself here a little bit, size myself down. Right here, you can see these are the graphics from that. And as you see here, Spencer Cox has 43% of the vote. And Phil Lyman is about 15%, which is really surprising for a write-in candidate. It is very hard for a write-in candidate to win any race. It's only been done in Congress twice. I think the only time it's ever happened here in Utah was a legislative race, and I wrote about that. And that was when they wanted to when people got mad at their local legislator. But it's never happened on a statewide race. But this poll from Noble Predictive Insights has Lyman at 15%, Cox at 43%, and you see right here, Brian King, he is at 26%. And so that's a pretty good idea. It's not taking enough. Lyman is not taking enough of the vote away from Cox to impact the trajectory of the race. It looks like Cox is still on a path to win a second term. But this is a significant problem for Cox because he's going to be less than 50%. He's going to win with a plurality if this poll is correct. And if you remember, Noble Predictive Insights absolutely nailed the GOP gubernatorial primary. They had Cox at 55, and he won with 54. They had Lyman very close to his final total as well. So you can pretty much trust these numbers. They know what they're doing. And if this poll is to be believed, it's quite possible that Cox ends up below 50% winning another term. And that's a significant drop off from where he was just 4 years ago. He won his first term in office with 63% of the vote. So this is a 20% drop for Cox. It's a 20% drop for Cox just from 4 years ago. And it's because Phil Lyman right here is taking a lot of, because Phil Lyman is taking a lot of the vote away from him. So we've seen that on the gubernatorial race. There's a couple of other polls that they released today as well. Let's look at the presidential race. And right here, you'll see that Donald Trump, 54% here in Utah, and Kamala Harris at 34%, which tracks with what we've seen. Utah's a red state. There's really no chance that it's going to flip to Democratic control. This 54% is really interesting, though. And I want to talk about that for just a second, because this is very close to what Donald Trump has gotten in his election bids the last two times he was on the ballot here in Utah. If you remember in 2016, he got about 45% of the vote. He won with a plurality. Independent candidate Evan McMullin pulled about 20% of the vote there. And so Trump had less than 50%. And then 4 years ago in 2020, he only got about 58% of the vote. And Utah is just not a stronghold for MAGA Republicans. People have called it the most Trump skeptical red state in the union. And that's pretty true, because there are a lot of Republicans, a lot of people here in Utah, mostly members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who are uncomfortable with Trump's personal behavior, with his insulting of other people, and they really are uncomfortable with that, and so they're really skeptical and don't want to cast a vote for him. And in 2016, Evan McMullin gave them someone that they could feel comfortable voting for. And then, as we saw 4 years ago, only got 58%. So this number also tracks with what we've been seeing for the past two election cycles from Donald Trump. And then one other poll that they had released is in the U.S. Senate race. No surprise here. John Curtis, the Republican, is in prime position to win a 6-year term, move up from the House, and succeed Mitt Romney in the U.S. Senate, who is retiring after one term. So John Curtis is it looks like he's going to be heading to a victory. Again, that's no surprise. Utah's a Republican state. It's been a long, long time since the state has elected any Democrat statewide. I believe the last one was Jan Graham in 1996 as Attorney General. That was the last time that a Democrat won statewide here in the state. So those are the three polls that were released today by Noble Predictive Insights, and you can pretty much, you know, expect those things to be accurate as you look at those. So there's a couple of other. Yeah, sorry, I got a little bit distracted there. Let me grab a drink. Anyway, if you're just joining us on the live stream, and I see there's a few of you out there, I appreciate that. A few of you out there. My name is Brian Schott. I am the publisher and managing editor of Utah Political Watch. I'm an independent journalist covering politics here in Utah. You can sign up for my newsletter for free. That's at utahpoliticalwatch.news, or you can support my work with by becoming a paid subscriber. And you can subscribe for as little as $5 a month, and that's the kind of thing. But every dollar really helps support this enterprise, this independent journalism. And one of the things, I guess, one of the selling points of that is that I'm free to cover the stories that I want to cover. I'm free to cover the stories that are important to you. I don't have anybody that has to sign off on the story. I don't have to fight with editors to get that story done. I don't, there's no layers of bureaucracy here. I work for you. I work for my paying subscribers who support this work. So if you think that you can do that, if I know not everybody can swing a paid subscription right now, if you can, go to utahpoliticalwatch.news and sign up. I would really appreciate that. Okay, let's get back to some more reporting. Let's talk a little bit more about this poll, and then we'll get to a couple of other news stories that I wrote this week. The poll is really significant, especially on the gubernatorial race, because I said Cox finished. If these results hold true, the Cox about 43%. That's 20 points lower than what he got in 2020 when he first ran. And he said this is going to be his final term as governor. He would only serve 2 terms. So he doesn't have to worry about going forward. But this, he's never really been in a strong political position since he's been in office. If you will remember, in 2020, there was a 4-way primary for governor. You had Spencer Cox, you had John Huntsman, you had Thomas Wright, and you had Greg Hughes. And Spencer Cox, he won with about 35% of the vote. It was about 6,500 votes. That was the margin there. And that's how he secured the GOP nomination. Now, that was the ball game because this is a Republican state, and he was not going to lose to his Democratic opponent this year. So all he needed to do was get through the primary, much like this year. But the fact that he only got through the primary with about 36% of the vote, and now 4 years later, he is 20 points lower than what he was at in 2020. That's really got to tell you that he is not very strong politically. It's not a mandate for anything he wants to do. He really can't just go in and push people around and enact his agenda. He's really going to have to work with lawmakers to get anything done simply because he does not have a mandate based on these results. Okay, let's talk about a couple of other stories. I mentioned a lot about Phil Lyman. Well, let's talk a little bit more about Phil Lyman. And as you can see, I wrote this story this week. You'll remember a couple of weeks ago, Phil Lyman got a lot of media attention, when he announced that he was going to take his effort to kick Spencer Cox off the ballot to the United States Supreme Court. Well, he sent his stuff in, but it got rejected for a filing error. So he really hasn't filed anything with the U.S. Supreme Court. And I had been asking him about this for a couple of weeks because I did not see his filing show up anywhere on the Supreme Court website. It wasn't on the docket. It just was not available anywhere. And then on Monday night, he has a weekly call with volunteers. He's not on all of those, but volunteers for his campaign get together online on Monday night. And I'm a part of those calls, or sometimes I get recordings of those calls. And he told people that he told the attendees that his filing had been returned for a filing error. Now think about this. His filing had to submit somewhere between 7 and 10 copies. I can't remember the exact number, but they were 700 pages each printed out. So he sent these boxes into the United States Supreme Court, and they sent those boxes right back. And now he has to send those boxes in again in order to get his case in front of the justices. I really don't think it's going to be held before the election, or it's going to be heard before the election. Supreme Court rules on Wednesdays when they're not hearing arguments, and on Fridays the justices have conference where they meet in a room and they discuss cases, petitions, and Phil Lyman has filed a petition with the Supreme Court. They'll discuss petitions and whether they will hear them, and most of those petitions are rejected. It's highly unlikely that his petition is going to get on this Friday's conference agenda. Now, there is a possibility that he could go for an emergency ruling or an emergency stay with Justice Gorsuch, who is over the 10th Circuit here in Utah. And so that's who they're making their appeal to. But again, that's what they call the shadow docket. So anyway, that's the story here. Phil Lyman, he said he was going to go to the Supreme Court, but there were some problems with it. But also in this, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit to this part of the story. This really got my attention when he was talking about it during the meeting. Lyman still is having trouble getting over his loss to Spencer Cox. He's really having trouble coming to grips with it. And that was really apparent in this call. I mean, if it's not apparent if you haven't been on social media, where he's been falsely claiming that Spencer Cox is an illegitimate candidate, or Spencer Cox did not qualify for the ballot, or he's asking the legislature to throw Spencer Cox off, or call on him to withdraw from the race. None of that is going to happen. But in this call, you could tell he was really having trouble dealing with accepting that he lost that primary election to Spencer Cox, because he said during this call that 40,000 votes had been preloaded into the voting machines, because he said there were 40,000 votes already in the tally, already in the voting machines. And he said he knows it's been done before because of stolen election. And Phil has been really into this election denial kick since after 2020. He teamed up with former Representative Steve Christiansen, who was chasing what they call phantom votes, claiming that there were people who did not exist who voted in the 2020 election. And none of that is true, but that's something he has glommed onto. And it's also not surprising that Phil is pushing these conspiracy theories about about a stolen election, because he has in his inner circle a couple of pretty big election deniers. On that call last night, there was a woman named Sophie Anderson. If you are familiar with her at all online, she is part of a group called Two Red Pills. They are big-time election deniers here in Utah. Phil was a close ally of Tina Peters, the Colorado clerk who just went to jail, was just sentenced to jail for breaching voting machines in the aftermath of the 2020 election and giving access to those voting machines to someone allied with Mike Lindell of MyPillow. And speaking of Mike Lindell, Phil Lyman is also an associate of Mike Lindell. He's spoken at the same events as Lindell has. And Sophie Anderson, one of the Two Red Pills, are also very close to Mike Lindell. So it's this whole little, it's a whole little circle that he's a part of that are election deniers. So of course he's making all of these claims, but he's claiming that 40,000 votes were preloaded into the machine. And that's something we're starting to see again ahead of this year's election. Donald Trump and his allies are bringing that back up. And he also, and I don't think this was the smartest thing Phil Lyman has ever done, he also specifically said that Smartmatic, the voting machine company, the software was designed to steal elections. His exact quote was, the Smartmatic software was created to steal elections. No question about that. If you look into the history, that's what this software was designed to do. Smartmatic is very litigious. If you remember, they got a $789 million settlement with, I think it was Newsmax. Um, uh, Perhaps that was the other one. Perhaps that was Dominion Voting Systems. But they have sued Newsmax and One American News Network. They settled out of court with them. They had a settlement that was undisclosed, but it's speculated to be millions and millions of dollars because of these lies about the 2020 election. And they're still suing Fox News. And now that these conspiracy theories about Smartmatic have popped back up, Smartmatic is saying they are paying attention to these things. Now, I reached out to them for comment. They didn't reply to me, but they are aware that Phil Lyman said this. So, Phil Lyman, election denier, still doing it a lot. It's really quite alarming. Okay, a couple of other stories that I wrote this week. Let me see if there's any questions in the chat. I'm still trying to get the hang of all this. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. But yeah, I don't see anything right now. But if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will try to get to those. And remember to sign up for my newsletter at utahpoliticalwatch.news. Okay, so two other quick stories that I want to talk about that I wrote this week. This one is kind of complicated. So let me pull it up here on the screen so we can all enjoy it together. So you remember earlier this year that Utah lawmakers passed a bill. It was Senate Bill 161. And what that did was it created a mechanism for the state to possibly take over the operation of a coal-fired power plant near Delta that is scheduled for shutdown next year. So here's the backstory. That plant is run by a group called Intermountain Power Agency, IPA. And they are shutting that plant down as part of their transition to renewable sources. They're going to be opening a natural gas plant after they shut this one down, and they have agreements with the Environmental Protection Agency to do that. Well, lawmakers are very worried about the possibility that we might not be able to generate enough power for a growing population here in Utah. There's a lot of demand on power, and they're very worried about that. So they created this bill that has a mechanism in it in which the state could take over and operate that plant beyond the July 1st, 2025 closure date. It does a couple of things as well. It requires IPA to get a new permit, to apply for a new permit with the state to keep that plant open. Now, when this bill was passed, IPA, and that's a group of local municipalities who are part of this group that's over that power plant. Now, most of the power at that power plant goes to California, okay? So they are partners with the city of Los Angeles. And most of that power goes to California, like 95% of what they generate. But if they need it, the cities can draw on that power plant rather than going out and buying power in the open market. I know that Bountiful did that. They did that too because they were going to have brownouts last summer simply because there was so much demand in the summertime for power, and they didn't want to have to go out on the open market, which would have cost their residents thousands of dollars. So they drew on their allotment from IPA. And if IPA goes through and applies for this permit to keep the plant opening, that breaks an agreement with the EPA. Okay, and they've made this agreement with the EPA to shut down the power plant It breaks it, and that could cause the EPA to step in and order the power plant closed immediately. Okay, so that's the backstory. But lawmakers want to see if they can buy this coal power plant and keep it operating because we might need the power. So that's the backstory. Well, a couple of months ago, the EPA made a ruling on Utah's proposed plan under a program called the Regional Haze Program. And that program, what it does is it's trying to reduce the amount of pollution from haze in national parks. And it wants to restore the view to as close to natural as possible by 2064. And once a decade, states can try to alter their plan. They say, here's how we're going to try to control pollution, a lot of it from coal-fired power plants that is gunking up the view in these national parks. And so what happened was in August, the EPA disapproved part of Utah's application under the Regional Haze Program. And the reason they did that is because Utah really didn't have Utah's plan for controlling pollution from these power plants was not sufficient. There really wasn't an enforceable mechanism. So they said, this is not going to work. We've disapproved it. And so they opened up a 30-day comment period that ended in September. And the reason they did that is because since they said that Utah's plan was not sufficient, the EPA now can come in and impose stricter federal pollution guidelines on the state because the state wasn't doing enough. And so in this public comment period, they wanted to get public input on possibly implementing stricter federal standards on the state for curbing air pollution. But they also wanted input on what this SB 161 would do to the regional, what the impacts from SB 161. And that's, that's interesting because what that means is what they're trying to do is trying to gauge the impact of what would happen if the state took over this coal plant, and there's a couple of other coal-fired power plants that are also in the process of being decommissioned that the state could take over. What that would do to this regional haze plan. So during that public comment period, the EPA got about 5,600 comments, and among them were letters sent by 16 Republicans in the Utah Senate, and Senate President Stuart Adams and House Speaker Mike Schultz. And these letters were nearly identical. And what these letters did was they argued that keeping this power plant open, or SB 161, did not mandate that the state is going to keep these power plants running. It simply was a way to create a process. And if you see this right here, it says the legislation does not require keeping coal-burning power plants operational, but simply creates a rigorous information gathering and decision-making process before any decision to keep the plants running. And they also said that this process strikes a balance between Utah's environmental steward obligations and generating power for the state. They said, we want to emphasize that this legislation aims to strike a careful balance between the state's commitment to responsible environmental stewardship and compelling interest in providing adequate, affordable, and reliable energy to Utah citizens. I've spoken to people in the EPA, and they said this is really unusual. They've never seen a coordinated effort like this. But lawmakers are trying to convince the EPA that this process that they created that could keep a coal-fired power plant running would not impact the state's efforts to curb pollution. Take that how you will. So I wrote that story this week, and you can read it on my website, utahpoliticalwatch.news. And then let's see, the last story that I want to bring up this evening. Oh, it's been a very long day. The last story that I want to bring up today is this one. Let me pull it up here. Hang on just a moment. I'm just getting the hang of this thing. It'll get better, I swear. Aha! Right here, Senator Mike Lee Senator Mike Lee is holding up the appointment of the head of the Office of Government Ethics. Okay. This is the person who is in charge of enforcing ethics laws on the executive branch, on the federal government. They serve 5-year terms, so they overlap administrations to try and take the politics out of it. If you remember, during this really wasn't a big deal until the first Donald Trump administration. And then in the first couple of years of Donald Trump's administration, he clashed with Walter Schaub, who was the head of the OGE during that time. And then, and that's when people really started, this office really started to come on people's radar. Well, anyway, last year, Joe Biden nominated David Hatema to be the director of the Office of Government Ethics. And when it came up for a vote this year, I don't know why it took so long to get through the process of hearings. That's the U.S. Senate for you. They're not very efficient. But when it came up for a nomination, when it came up for a vote on the Senate floor in September, Lee objected because he was worried this was part of an effort to weaponize the federal government against Donald Trump. And so he wants to wait for any confirmation to happen until after the election. What that could do is that could allow Donald Trump to select his own ethics director. To pick the person who's going to be in charge when he's naming members or naming people to his administration. That it could set that up and really, given what we know about the first Trump administration, it's not a stretch to say that this could hamper efforts to make people comply with federal ethics guidelines, federal ethics laws. Okay. Anyway, there's another part of this that was reported on by a great website known as The Lever. And what they found out is when someone is appointed to a position in the federal government, and they look at their ethics and they look at conflicts of interest, sometimes the OGE will have to say, you're going to need to divest yourself of this business. You're going to need to put it in a blind trust. You're going to need to not be in charge of it. If you remember, Donald Trump didn't divest himself of his companies, but what he did do is he put his sons in charge of his corporation. But there's been lots of reporting afterwards that he was still involved in the day-to-day operations. Anyway, when someone does decide to divest themselves of that, they can get a pretty significant tax break. There is a very obscure part of the tax code that will allow the Office of Government Ethics to offer big tax breaks to White House officials who divest their holdings because of a conflict of interest. And this matters because of Elon Musk. Now, Donald Trump and Elon Musk have talked about appointing him to a position in the Trump White House and another Trump administration. And Elon has a lot of government contracts, SpaceX, Tesla. He's got a lot of Starlink. These have a lot of government contracts. And the OGE would be in charge of making sure that there were no ethics violations with that. Well, Elon could divest himself of a large portion of his businesses and get a massive tax break. It could be the biggest tax break in history for the world's biggest man. The world's richest man, the biggest tax break in history for the world's richest man, if Elon decides to divest himself. And Donald Trump would have control over who that person would be. And this is significant because Senator Mike Lee, and you'll see it right here, let me pull this up. Senator Mike Lee and Elon Musk are buddies. He posted this a couple of weeks ago. I can't tell where they're at, but they're in a meeting, and he says, "I met the most interesting guy. He grew up in South Africa. He's now an American hero." So Senator Mike Lee his delay could result in a big tax break for his bud, Elon Musk, and benefit Donald Trump as well, and anybody else in the Trump administration. Now, if Donald Trump loses and Kamala Harris wins the election, well, then she would be in charge of picking whoever, then they could take that nominee and put him in office or whomever. But that's the situation. Anyway, okay, I've talked enough. It's been about half an hour. I've talked enough and my voice is shot. I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. And remember, go to my website, utahpoliticalwatch.news. Sign up for my newsletter. Um, if you can swing it, become a paid subscriber. Support my work. Support this journalism. It's more important than ever to keep our public officials accountable, and that's what I do. And I work for you. I report on the stories that are most important to you. And so if you can become a subscriber, I'd really appreciate it. You can also make a one-time donation. Buy me a coffee, you know. Every little bit helps. Anyway, go to utahpoliticalwatch.news and sign up or subscribe. Love to have you as a reader. Would really love to have you as a subscriber. Anyway, we'll do this again soon, probably in a couple of days, and we are going to do it on election night. We're going to talk live election results as they come in, especially here in Utah. But remember, utahpoliticalwatch.news. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you soon. And there you go.